Okay, so let's get started. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the latest of Mark Schenker's literary series with us. It's always a pleasure. It's always very interesting and informative, and I'm glad to see you all, at least in the world of cyberspace and Zoom. Um, Quick introduction, a couple of comments about Mark. Most of you know him, I'm sure, but for some of you who may not have attended one of these before, uh, he served in various decanal roles at Yale College since 1990, and he retired at the end of June. He's a former lecturer in the English department. He received his PhD from Columbia University with a concentration in 19th century and early 20th century English literature. And he had taught previously at Columbia, New York University, and Trinity College in Hartford. And outside of academia, Mark has for over 35 years lectured on literature and film and has led book discussion series in more than 100 venues in Connecticut, including public libraries like ours, museums, and cultural centers. He also conducts monthly sessions for a number of private reading groups in the state. And in 2001, he received the Wilbur-Cross Award for Outstanding Humanities Scholar, presented by the Connecticut Humanities Council. We love having him here. I know you all do too. We'll have him back as much as we can fit into the schedule. And I want to mention that late this summer, Mark launched a website for where he offers fee-based lectures of this type and by Zoom. And so you can go there and find out all about that. He also will continue to do this with us, of course, and also will link to our classes that he does with us on his new website. He also has a new email address. So as usual, Mark is always happy to have direct emails sent to him by our attendees. If you want to do that, please let me know, and I'll give you his new email address, and you can pursue that. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark so we can get started. It's going to be a great series. I'm fascinated by the concept and two of the books on the list. One of the books on the list I have not read, and I'm looking forward to reading that when we get towards the end. Pay attention to the dates, folks, because we have 4 in a row on Thursdays like this. Then we have 2 sessions on Tuesdays. Then we take a break of a couple of weeks, and the final session is in November. So pay attention to the dates. With that, turn it over to Mark.
So I want to thank Michael in the usual way, not only for having me back, but being generous about collaborating with me about topics. And it was Michael who said to me back in the spring, what did I think about doing a series on utopias in literature? And I said, I'd love to do that if we keep in mind that many utopian books are really dystopian. And then he said, would you begin with Plato's Republic? And I said, no way in Greece would I do that, because it's not a book for a literary group to start the season. Utopia is. But I want to say a few things about Plato's Republic and why it would naturally be on Michael's mind and other people's mind to start a course in utopias that way. This is a survey of literary utopias. And Plato, writing in the 4th century, was very concerned about how you create a just state. He was interested in the philosophical underpinnings of justice. And he was aware, and I want to tell you, this may be the most significant thing I say to you all evening, that the entire enterprise of Homeric epic poetry, which is the 8th century BC, so 400 years before Plato, the entire enterprise of Greek tragedy, which are more or less contemporaneous or a little older than Plato, is to show that human beings are capable of godlike virtues, but they also are capable of monstrous vices. That they do horrific things, especially in the plays, kill children and feed them to their enemies, incest, maiming, all kinds of things. But the monsters that you see in Greek literature are not newly created monsters. They're mishmashes of animals that already exist. You can make your own list. The Sphinx, the Centaur, the Griffin. Why is it that the Greeks didn't decide to create a completely new monster like Godzilla? It's because they were uh, using the model of farm animals that were born as monstrosities, two-headed pigs, animals with their organs on the outside. And they called those things monsters, which comes from the word to look at, because they thought that that was a punishment from God, that what the gods did to punish is to warp. And they came up with this notion that at one end of the spectrum of life are the gods. The gods, of course, are featured as human beings, and they are susceptible to pettiness and jealousy and anger. They are um, exalted human beings. And at the other end of the spectrum, there are these bestial characters, these monstrous amalgams of animals, because human beings are capable of animal like behavior. And the entire enterprise of the ancient Greek world is to try to plot humanity lower than the gods and higher than the beasts. I want you to keep that in mind because that's what it all boils down to, that we are capable of aspiring to divine compassion, justice, understanding, but we are also susceptible to being pulled downward. And that's a constant threat. It's in that context that Plato wants to talk about how, with such people, you and me and other failed people, you create a just state. He didn't call it utopia, he called it a republic, a way to organize politically and socially the disparate members of a society. The reason we're not reading him is because I'm not sure there's enough bang for your buck for a literary series. But what we should keep in mind is he's doing it because the Greeks, among the many things they invented, was they invented the idea of citizenship. What does it mean to be a Greek? What does it mean to move from these disparate city states to a nation that you could be a citizen of? And so much of what we know about political administration of justice comes from the Greeks. The founding fathers of America used the Romans and Roman orators because they didn't have access to the original Greek at the time. But so Plato is interested in the administration of governmental social oversight of people who need to be governed because we're capable of bad things. And although he writes it as a dialogue, a very common philosophical form, and it's well written, and there's the allegory of the cave, and there's lots of merit, it doesn't touch on the literary things that I'm going to be talking about as I move now to Thomas More, who was a lawyer, a theologian, a poet, a administrator in the government of Henry VIII. More writes Utopia in 1516. He hasn't fallen out of favor yet. It's going to be a couple of decades before Henry VIII decides to get rid of the Catholic Church. And More is not just Catholic, More is rabidly Catholic. He has been spending most of his adult life chasing down heretics and arguing against Protestantism and other kinds of heresies. And his dates are 1478 to 1535, ended early by execution, as you know. And he published Utopia in 1516, and he decides to spell Utopia with a U. And if you read the promo for the series, that means in Greek, no place. Topoi is a place, a topic comes from the idea of what place or what issue you're going to talk about. He knew that a good place was Utopia, pronounced the same way. He decided to go with Utopia. That should give us pause. He was writing about Utopia as a faraway island where one of the people who visited there, a man named Raphael Hythloday, comes to tell More, the character in the story is Thomas More and a fellow named Giles, in More's backyard of his estate. tells him the story of Utopia. So very different from the Republic, which is a philosophical dialogue. I'm going to pause there for a moment and ask Michael to channel any of you who have recently read or reread Utopia and have any comments, necessarily brief, please, to make about visiting or revisiting um, Utopia, More's greatest work, one of the greatest prose works of the uh, 16th century, a very influential book. I'm going to open it up to comments before I go on with my other kinds of comments about Utopia.
Okay, folks, so I usually mention this in my intro, but I'll do it now because it's relevant. You use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen in order to give any comments or questions, but Mark's looking for comments this time, about your reactions to reading or rereading the book. So feel free to put them in the Q&A. I will see them and I will relay them to Mark. I could just tell you, Mark, that on going back over this book, which I've read a few times, at one point I was a philosophy major and I took an entire seminar called The Idea of Utopia, which is part of where we got this idea for this series from. And the interesting thing about most utopias is I always wonder, what's the energy source? Because you need energy production to make things work. And also, how do you deal with fundamental human nature, because they usually do a little bit of magic wand waving to sort of pretend that people will behave the right way and they don't worry about what if they don't. So like I love the idea in this book that everybody has to wear the same gray cloak, but what happens if somebody dyes it a different color? I mean, what happens? We don't know.
Well, we do know from Star Trek and other futuristic dramas that it does seem that in the future, there's no such thing as fashion. People wear the same outfits. And when we get to The Handmaid's Tale, we'll see how that figures. Any comment yet from anybody, Michael?
Not so far.
Okay, so I'm going to go on because there's a lot to cover, and I think people will appreciate that it's not necessarily.
Oh, I got one. I just got one.
Go ahead.
The three most interesting topics I read in Utopia deal with the perspective, rich, religious male, women, and slavery. Each is starting from the perspective of today and here. Also, the prince is Big Brother.
Okay, thanks for that. I hope that anyone who read the book will feel their investment was paid by reading it, even though I'm not going to talk in detail about the book itself, as you will see. So the first question is, why is Thomas More, if he wants to define an ideal state, why doesn't he just come out and say, here's what I think an ideal state would be? Why doesn't he write something closer to the Republic? Why does he create a literary context for a traveler named Raphael Hithliday to come back from a faraway island? It's because he knows that readers have always been fascinated by places that actually exist and are too far away for them to know. That's going to be a big motivating factor to the popularity of Gulliver's Travels. People wanted to actually believe that these people went to these places, and there was always a hunger. So Moore knows that if he just says, here's my idea of a perfect world, people aren't so interested in Thomas More, but they'd be much more interested in a sort of narrative drama where a guy comes and tells you about the wonderful world. It's in two parts, the book. The first part is where Hithliday is told things about England, and then they take a break. Moore invites them to have some food, get their rest, because they have asked him to report on Utopia. Well, some of the more learned people in Moore's time would know that the name Raphael Hithliday means expert at nonsense. It's worth keeping that in mind. It's also worth keeping in mind that an awful lot of what Moore has Hithliday describe, that Moore is writing through Hithliday, is overly rational. There's a lot of things about life that seem monk-like, cloister-like, and you say to yourself, how serious is this work about actually proposing a model for society? And I'm here to tell you it's not very serious. It's satirical, which is why he calls it no place rather than best place. Why he calls the messenger who comes to bring it a expert of nonsense. Why would a man who is not just a Christian but a Roman Catholic, well, you still could be a Roman Catholic before 1534 when the Catholic Church is abolished, and 1535 Sir Thomas More is abolished. Um, why would a Catholic, a devout Catholic, pretend to create or report on a world that is perfect in human terms? It's because he knows it can't be done. The tension in people who talk about perfect worlds is what Michael referred to in his brief comments, which is the problem is human nature. Why is it that there has to be a governor, a prince, a administrative body to create such a place? Why do there have to be people in charge? Why is perfection not natural? Isaac Newton would say it's because of the second law of thermodynamics. It's a good law. It says everything runs down. Why is it that your room, your house, your kitchen, left unattended, well, you're living in it, will eventually get messy? But no amount of passage of time will have it get neat. Why is it that things don't get neat randomly? They get messy randomly. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Things go wrong, things break down. I'm doing a series this fall at the Zoom series at the Ridgefield Library on AI gone wrong. And when someone asked me, or have there been books for a while about that notion, I said, as far back at least as 2001 A Space Odyssey. What's the matter, Dave? How is AI gone amok? Uh, it is the nature of nature that it's imperfect, which is why everybody who wants to make a perfect world has to do work. If we were capable of perfection, why wouldn't it just come out? So I hope this is revealing to you what I'm about to say. In Tennyson's great poem, The Lotus Eaters, taken from an episode of the Odyssey, he imagines that the mariners now on the island of the Lotus Eaters have become so intoxicated with this drug, this flower, as they do in the story, that they decide they don't want to go home. And in the poem, they luxuriate in their druggy state, thinking they have the abilities of gods. And it is the hero, Odysseus, who urges them to strike on and get back to the living of the world. But when the men, in their sort of rebellion, say, you know what, let's not listen to Odysseus, he got us into this mess. Let's swear an oath that we will stay here in this perfect world of the Lotus Eater. And the question that Tennyson is not asking, but is hoping we'll ask is, if it's such a nice world, why do they have to swear to stay? Why do you have to compel people to stay in a world that they've just said is perfect? It's because the undercurrent, I'm purposely using a title metaphor, is that they know they should go back. They should go back, but they want to stay. And so they invent a requirement for staying. We will swear to stay. Why is it in all versions of utopias that people have to be governed? And remember, one meaning of governed is that you have a leader, but another is to be disciplined, govern your emotions. Good government has to do with restrictions and laws and penalties and fines. Why is it that we have to administer perfection? Because we can't grow to it randomly. The Utopia is published in 1516. In England, 15 years later, Thomas Eliot, Elyot, publishes a very famous book called The Book of the Governor, 1531. And his dates are overlap a great deal with Thomas More. He lives a little bit longer because he didn't have his head removed. And in Italy, a very influential writer named Castiglione wrote the Book of the Courtier in 1528. So Utopia 1516, the Courtier in 1528, the Book of the Governor in 1531. When you hear the Book of the Courtier, you think of the book of the fancy guy in court. Think of it instead as if it were the book of the cabinet member. Is that what it means? That's what it means. Castiglione is trying to tell Italian aristocrats how to get the breeding to be good advisors to the leader of the country. Thomas Eliot is writing a book to tell educated men, they don't care about women then, educated men how to become governors, mayors, governors of areas, princes, kings, how to mind the government of the nation. And why is this? Why is there so much attention in this time of the Renaissance to breeding governors, breeding cabinet members? I'm quite serious. Courtier in this sense means a member of the court who can offer his wisdom to the monarch. It's because something has been lost between the Middle Ages, which are now dawn, and the Renaissance. And that's the great chain of being. The Middle Ages taught that the natural order of the world is everything is on a great vertical chain of life, and everything on it is subservient to the thing above it and is dominant to the thing below it. I'm talking in shorthand, but that great chain of being organized the world vertically and was very much influenced by the hegemony of the Holy Roman Empire and the Roman Catholic Church, which found that that kind of idea of something and somebody else, even all the ranks of angels, the ranks of clerics and bishops and monsignors and cardinals, this notion that you organize the world up and down and everything has its place. It is conducive to discipline. It is conducive to know that you're born a serf, you're going to die a serf. If you're a vassal, you may get closer to a lord, but you're not going to become one. And earls and barons and counts, everything has its place. And what happens with the onset of the Renaissance, all of this is going to be relevant to our series. I hope you don't think I'm blathering. I did all my blathering in August. All of this is because when the Renaissance comes aboard, when someone wakes up and says it's Renaissance, the world becomes horizontal rather than vertical. People like John Donne and Shakespeare and other poets and thinkers say, you know what? Things aren't just organized up and down. Lots of things are like other things on the same level. Also, incipient capitalism meant that you could now make your living from investments, usually in shipping, that you didn't have to be born into wealth to make wealth, and that it was possible to become a great man. We're only talking about men, unfortunately, by changing your faith. And so you could step out of the chain. And people know that the Catholic Church is losing its foothold in England. When More writes Utopia, it's still decades, 1516, not 1534. But the bubbling up of opposition to the Roman Catholic Church, some of it for national reasons, it's Italian, it's European, it's not good old English. Some of it for personal reasons. People knew that if the church was cast out, they might be able to buy the land on which this enormous abbey or cloister or cathedral is resting. And some people believed that Catholicism was the wrong kind of religion. I don't mean that everyone was unprincipled. And so some of these writers are thinking the world has lost its mooring in the great chain of being, and it's about to lose, or it may well lose, its mooring in the religious sense of a church where everyone is governed by a pope who is not English. And so, if that's the world we're facing, we better make sure people know how to behave. We better create books that teach people how to be governors, people who govern, not like the Connecticut governor. We should teach people how they can advise the people in command. It was a cultural moment when people were worried about, in the absence of the things that sustained us, how are we going to sustain ourselves? Now, to go back to Utopia, if Thomas More had a serious notion that what he wanted to do is say, here's the best possible world we could create, he was capable of writing it, but he didn't write it. He has a man come with an absurd name, an expert in nonsense, who tells a tale, some of it believable, much of it not, but none of it congruent with Thomas More's notion of devout Catholicism, which is that perfection is found somewhere else. The best we can do is to serve God in the wit of our mind. He says in one of his letters, and it's quoted or it's used in A Man for All Seasons, that the animals serve him in their innocence, the stars in their glory, but human beings are to serve them, him, God, in the tangle of their wit. They're supposed to use their intellect. And he uses his intellect in Utopia to invite people, the Latin readers of his book, who are thinking, oh, this is another one of those Republic like or Book of the Governor like serious instruction manuals for how you can improve the world. Plato was writing quite seriously about this is how we should organize society. And again, he thinks you need to do that because the material, human being, are dangerous things. They need to be governed. But Moore is doing something completely different. He's having a satire at the expense of the reader. The people who could read the Latin would almost certainly know that the Greek was purveyor of nonsense. They would know that utopia with a U was quite different from an EU. So, what is Moore saying? And I'm going to call your attention here at the halfway point of our session to the way the book ends overall. So, the first part, again, is not about utopia, it's the Englishman talking to the visitor. And then the second long part is all the explanation Q&A about how life is in utopia. And it ends this way. Thus, when Raphael had made an end of his tale, though many things came to my mind, which in the manners and laws of the people seemed to be instituted and founded of no good reason, not only in the fashion of their chivalry and in their sacrifices and religion, and in others of the laws, but also, yea, and chiefly in that which is the principal foundation of their ordinances, that is to say, in the community of their life and living, without any occupying of money, by which thing only all nobility, magnificent worship, honor, and majesty, the true ornaments and honors, as the common opinion is of a commonwealth, utterly be overthrown and destroyed. It's a kind of socialist state. So he has lots of issues. He thinks that many of these things are founded of no good reason. So you say to yourself, if he's serious about putting forth a utopia, he could absolutely have a straw man come from this faraway land and say, this is what we do. And Thomas More, in the novel, we'll call it, not really a novel, but could say, you know what, I think I see a problem here. And what we'd expect is More would give a counter argument for how you could improve that or why it's a bad idea. That's not what happened. He continues, yet because I knew that he was weary of talking and was not sure whether he could abide that anything be said against his mind, especially because I remembered that he had reprehended that fault in others, which he afraid lest he should be not wise enough and they should find some fault in other men's attention. He's tired I have lots of things to say that are critical. He may not be up to it. Therefore, I, praising both their institutions and his communication, that is, flattering him uh, with lies, took him by the hand and led him into supper, saying that we would choose at another time to weigh and examine the same matters, and to talk with him more at large therein, which would to God might once come to pass. So you say, okay, so this is the end of part two. Tommy, where's part three? There's no part three. He goes on, in the meantime, as I cannot agree and consent to all the things that he said, being else without doubt a man singularly well learned, he's a smart guy, and also in all worldly manners, exactly and profoundly experienced, so must I needs confess and grant that many things he in Utopian wheel, which in our cities I may rather wish than hope for. Thus ended the afternoon's talk of Raphael Hyperidae concerning the laws and institutions of the island of Utopia. When he says, I'd rather more likely wish than hope for, is this is never going to happen because we're sinners, because we're imperfect. And why doesn't More write part three? He never intended to write part three. He created Raphael Hyperidae to feed the passion of the time for conversations about perfect world. He made him a visitor from a faraway place because people like the romance and adventure of that. And he put at the end of the story what true perfection is. The ideal world, and here's the payoff at halftime, is a world in which your host understands that you're tired and you're hungry, disagrees with much of what you said, but is not going to bring it up because doesn't want to cause trouble, and does the Christian thing of taking you inside for food and presumably to stay overnight. That's the utopia of Christian community. And it's the great hidden joke, I'll call it, in Utopia. More was great friends with Desiderius Erasmus. They had almost the same time frame. And Desiderius Erasmus is famous for a book called In Praise of Folly, which he published in 1509, so 7 years before Utopia, published it in Latin, and he wrote it while he was staying at More's estate. They were great friends. They were two of the most devout, and I will say rabid, defenders of Catholicism. And since, like More, he lived, More not so very long, after the Anglican Church was created, Erasmus's dates, I'm missing them now. It'll come to me, I'm sorry. He lived to 1536, so 2 years after. They were both rabidly, I'm using this word purposely, trying to push out any anti-Catholic feeling that was throughout Europe, in the Netherlands, in England especially, had less of a hold in Spain and Italy because of the long relationship of those countries with the Roman Catholic Church. And he wrote In Praise of Folly to talk about how foolish the world is. And he has it told by Folly, who talks about how glorious folly is, the foolishness of people. And it's another way of saying you're not going to create a utopia out of this material. He knew that in 1 Corinthians, St. Paul said, the foolishness of God is wiser than men. No matter how hard you try, you are not going to be clever enough to create a perfect state. But More suggests very subtly, but you can do something. You can be a good host, which is a very big deal in the world, to be a good host. We're not just talking about a party at your house on Memorial Day or mine. We're talking about the idea that in the world of the Renaissance, and certainly in the world of Homer, people who traveled, commercial people, missionaries, people who were uh, emigrating or displaced by war or famine, they depended on the kindness of strangers. That's the moral of so much of the Odyssey, and in fact of the Iliad in its own way, that to be great is to be kind. And Plato is not writing in that vein, not because he's unkind. That's not his business. He's trying to administer people who are difficult to govern. But more is subtly suggesting there is a model for an ideal world. Give a guy a meal, give him a bed. In Michael Cunningham's magnificent novel, The Hours, which reworks Mrs. Dalloway, the character who is now the grown up boy who was abandoned by his mother has committed an act that removes him from the novel. And the mother who abandoned him when he was a little boy because she went to a hotel room to kill herself and instead read the novel Mrs. Dalloway and fell in love with the idea of that woman's sensibility and knew that although it was her son's birthday, she had to leave him and her husband. And she goes off. That woman is invited back to New York City, where a woman named Clarissa, which is Dalloway's first name, has invited her to be there because it's a great night of celebration for her son. I don't remember the son's name, but now a grown man. And the woman comes. But when she comes, the man is no longer there. If you've never read the novel, I won't give more details about that. But this woman, who some 30 or 40 years ago left her family, has come back. And she's one version of Mrs. Dalloway. And Clarissa, the woman who invites her in to the apartment in New York, is another version. And the boy, who's now a man, is yet another version. And Clarissa says to the woman who left her family because of Virginia Woolf's fiction, she says to him, "We have all these leftovers from the party that we didn't have. Why don't you have something to eat, sleep overnight, and we'll talk about things in the morning?" And that's the way the novel ends. That's Virginia Woolf channeled through Michael Cunningham, knowing that sometimes that's the best you can do for somebody. Think about in your lives, there are a lot of you here tonight, I know you run the gamut of ages, how often you have done the very small thing of making a casserole for grieving their neighbors. People are having a hard time. Maybe someone has died. Maybe someone's struggling in the hospital. And what do? You bring them food. Is it a big deal? Yes and no. It's an enormous deal because it's human kindness. People have to eat. And the gratitude for that little act, most of the people who get that food, they could get food. It's not a matter of money. It may not even be a matter of inconvenience with all the ways you can have food delivered. It's because friends, neighbors are reminding people of the community of kindness. I've gone on this long, not just because I'm a believer in the community of kindness, but this notion of the imperfect material that people are trying to shape into perfection is going to brood over this entire series. It's what makes so many utopias dystopias. And so much of the cure, whether we see it in the novels or not, or the pieces we're doing, are whether there's a community of kindness in the world that we look at. So, as a brief overview in the remaining time I have, and I told Michael I'd be talking a lot tonight in order to set the table for uh, what we're doing in the series. Gulliver's Travels was written as a great satire of humanity. It has four sections. The section where Gulliver is very big and the people he visits are very small is the one most people know. It appeals to children. It's been a children's book, a cartoon, a movie. which captured people's attention. And then the reverse of that, he's very small in a world that's very big. That's sometimes captured too. But people don't pay a lot of attention. Certainly, Hollywood and literary spin offs don't pay enough attention to the third and fourth. And that's where we're going to be concentrating most of our attention. The first two have to do with everything's relative. The 18th century, when this is being written, was a century when the great area of science was optics. Microscopes and telescopes made small things big, and if you looked at it the wrong way, big things small. And the idea that you could now see with new eyes led to people like Newton and others, astronomers, making new discoveries just because they could see better. And so Swift, who's a satirist, is playing with the notion of too big, too small, and that Gulliver, who is big in one world, is small in another. We're not going to be spending much time with that because that has nothing to do with Utopia. But the third world is visits to different utopian places. Third book is the third voyage. And the last voyage that Gulliver makes is to a place where the ruling class are reasonable horses or creatures that look like horses. And their name is spelled Houyhm. It's pronounced Winham, but if you have the courage, you're supposed to say it Winham. They neigh. Their name is the horse's neigh. And Gulliver, like um, uh, the planet of the apes, has to get used to the fact that the animals are in charge. And he's seen as a Yahoo, a word that was invented by Swift, as someone who is an animal, stupid, doesn't have reason, doesn't understand the way the world works, and cannot touch the perfection of the Winhams, the ruling class of these reasonable, perfectly reasonable animals. And he returns to England, Gulliver does, and finds that he likes spending time in the barn talking to his horse, who for some reason doesn't talk back. So we'll look at what Swift is saying, Swift the satirist, Swift the Catholic, what he's saying about an Anglican Catholic, what he's saying about the idea of perfection. And if you care to read Gulliver's Travels for next time, and you want to read only the third and fourth book, do. If you want to read only one book, read the fourth. You will see that at the end of Gulliver's Travels, there's another community of kindness moment that you may or may not recognize. And Swift, with no reference to Thomas More, is making the same point. You know that line, if you want justice, work for peace. If you want perfection, these writers are saying, be kind. And we will see when we move from that to Erewhon, uh, Samuel Butler's nearly reversed nowhere, what Victorians do with the idea of perfection in this late 19th century novel. And the Victorians, of course, were deeply concerned that there was no perfection capable of existing on this planet. And unlike the century beforehand, they worried that there was none after death either. 19th century is the century in which um, it was said famously, Gott ist tot, God is dead. And even Victorians who were raised as devout Christians worried that there was no afterlife because they thought of themselves, it was Nietzsche, by the way, who said God is dead. It is the Victorians encountered the idea that science suggested that the biblical story of creation was impossible. And the Victorians wanted to be seen as modern people, the great exhibition of modern invention. They wanted to be seen as worthy of being citizens of the greatest nation on the face of the earth. And they worried that it was silly to believe that a man could walk on water or rise from the dead. That explains why in the 1840s, the greatest living novelist of the day, Charles Dickens, wrote A Christmas Carol. It's called A Christmas Carol. It takes place on Christmas Eve and Christmas morning. It was not only sold during the Christmas season, it was marketed to be a Christmas gift for families. That four ghosts come to visit Ebenezer, and not one of them has anything to do with the Old or New Testament, let alone Christ, who is never mentioned by name in the novel. Because what Dickens is doing as a great Victorian is saying, we can resolve ourselves if we just be kind. If Scrooge would just reform himself and be a kind surrogate uncle to Tiny Tim will walk again. And it's not Abraham, it's not John the Baptist, it's not Mary Magdalene or the Virgin Mary or Jesus or any disciples who come to visit him. It's his former partner saying, I am living in a kind of hell. And it's three versions of Christmas, the last of which looks like a character out of an Igmar Bergman movie. What is the thing that frightens Scrooge most? By that guy pointing to the tomb who's wearing the seventh seal kind of outfit and holding the scythe. It's not that he'll go to hell, it's that he'll be forgotten and talked ill of, that people will take his belongings, and the men in the stock market will talk badly of Scrooge because he was unkind, he was a monster. And so he wakes up the next morning and remarks that the spirits have done it all overnight, and he decides to be a good man. And Dickens gets his Christianity without having a Messiah, which is the secret of religion in the Victorian period as far as the literature is concerned. Be kind, just don't mention the guy who told us to be kind. And one of uh, George Eliot's wittiest comment was that the prayer of the average Englishman in the 19th century was, Dear God, if there is a God, save my soul if I have a soul. So in the 19th century, when we get to Erewhon, you don't even have the basis that was the underpinning for Swift and for Moore of the actual belief in religion. And then when we turn to the 20th century, we have The Handmaid's Tale. I hope you've read it. I will say to you that if you haven't read it, you may be better and you're pressed for time, although there's more time in this series than some of the previous ones that Michael and I have done. If you've never read The Handmaid's Tale, investing the time in that will probably pay off better than investing the same time in Erewhon. I'd like you to read them all, but I just say that to you. And then we have the break that Michael mentioned, and a change not only in it being later dates, but sometimes Tuesdays, sometimes Thursday. Michael wanted the schedule to be imperfect to make the point about dystopia. We're going to turn to King Lear. It's not just so I can get another century, the 17th century, into our mix. We have the 16th with Moore and the 18th with Gulliver's Travels. But King Lear raises questions about the nature of nature. And although it's set in the kind of medieval world, one of the questions that Lear asks is, why is it that some of his daughters are so hard hearted against him and one of them is not, even though they all come from the same mother and father? He wonders, or Gloucester wonders, why is it that the son born out of wedlock would be called a natural son because it was born by natural desire rather than a rite in a church or a city hall? Why is that son so different from the son that he had in wedlock? And the son, Edmund, the evil son who was born out of wedlock, believes that he is a stronger person because nature is his goddess. He was not born under law, he was not born under ceremony or ritual. He was born naturally and therefore is more entitled to the world. And so, even though it seems like a digression, we're doing it for that reason. We're doing it because it's never a bad reason to do King Lear. And we're doing it because the penultimate book we're looking at is Station 11, a wonderful science fiction novel. Some of you may know it through the recent TV series that was very critically acclaimed. The wandering travelers in that post-epidemic world perform Shakespeare plays. And King Lear has a lot to say about what perfection is and how it comes back to a community of kindness. And then lastly, Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Doerr, who wrote All the Light We Cannot See, and a terrific um, collection of short stories called The Shell Collector, um, is a book that is set in three time frames: the ancient world, the contemporary world, and the future. If you set out to read it, do not be overwhelmed by the fact that it is a big and heavy book. It has lots of blank pages for the way it presents itself. It is eminently readable, and whenever you are in a chapter, the heading lets you know whether you're in the ancient world or the contemporary world or the world of the future. It may sound confusing, it's not, and it's a great satire which touches on utopias, dystopias, the influence of the ancient world on the current world, what people will do in search of a utopia, which may actually include time travel or space travel. It's another work of science fiction that is great literature. So, for 7 books, in however many weeks it turns out to be, in hour packages like this one that's coming to an end, I hope you'll find that it's a heady ride. And I want to say there's good reason to admire the writing of Thomas More, and even to enjoy the debate about, is this a good way to raise children or run a society? But the joke he's having, that he does not intend to be funny, is that the greatest act of perfection in the story is come on in, have something to eat, take a break. And his telling us that he has objections that he's going to keep mum about until Hip the Day is in a better frame of mind. That's what perfection is, or something close to it. Okay, Michael, I think I've gone full hour.
Yes, well, that was great. Very wide ranging, and certainly, I think makes everybody want to go through the whole series and not miss a single one. There's so many interesting aspects of this. Um, we did have a couple of questions or comments. I don't know if you want to take anything or.
Happy, I'm as long as I'm not overstaying my welcome. Sure.
No, you're not overstaying. You're welcome. Uh, Janet was saying that she was reminded of Marco Polo's stories of his travels that he told to Kubla Khan, which was another novel about utopias.
Uh huh.
And then she also added, and I wonder what you think of Calvino's Invisible Cities. I don't know if you've read that one.
I have taught a number of Calvino books, but not that book. And what's happened to me in my old age is books I have read but not taught are no longer in my mental file cabinet.
Sure, no, understandable.
Calvino's an excellent writer, and the idea that travelers come back to say there's a kind of look, they do this so much better than we do. But the idea is, why does that move to the idea of perfection? Why is there a heaven in most religions, not all religions? Because people want what the world can't give them. In this world, things run down.
Got it. And then a couple of comments were a little bit outside the book, but more about Moore and also his relation to the book. And I think some of the points you made, where Elizabeth said, "At first I was breathless that Moore was so forward-looking with respect to his economic outlook, but his utopia was not inclusive and included slavery."
Yeah.
And sort of a related comment to that was, so with all this kindness, so why is Moore in the real world such a cruel persecutor of heretics?
Okay, so 2 things. One is, it's not Moore's utopia, it's Hitler's utopia. Moore doesn't get a chance. I've made the point. We don't get Act 3 intentionally. Moore has no utopia in his back pocket.
Yeah.
The other question, what's the name of the person who asked this?
Liz Salazzo asked one of them, and
Well, anyway, I just want to Liz. It is a mystery that I am not going to be able to solve, why people who write about kindness are not kind themselves. And so I'm not in a position to explain about the psychology of Thomas More. Dickens, in his literature, was unfailingly compassionate to the downtrodden. He was very sensitive in his novels to other people. He was a brutal person to his wife. And when he wanted to shame her, he did it on the front page of a publication that he edited. He had power, money, and access to publicity that his poor wife did not have. He mocked her in his fiction. He had affairs with other women. He was not a good man, but he wrote literature about good men and sometimes women that many people still read today as examples of God bless us, everyone. The notion that every stranger is someone who deserves your kindness is a notion that Dickens resurrected in 19th century England when Darwinian principles were applied to economics and dog eat dog. And the reason women were consigned to being what's called the angel of the house, keeping the kids religious, teaching the girls how to sew and sing, teaching the boys to be smart, was that the husbands couldn't spend time on that because they were in the feral world of nature red in tooth and claw. The world was a hard place, and they had no time for the kind of niceties that women have. One of the hallmarks of the 19th century is that English culture discovered tragedy. The genre of the 18th century in England is satire, like Gulliver's Travels. The dominant genre in the 19th century in England is tragedy, and especially the dominance of the novel. The novel becomes the art form of the middle class, which is the dominant class, not the aristocrats, not the queen, in the 19th century. And we'll talk when we get to Erewhon about why people should have decided that tragedy is the main fact of life when that wasn't true in Swift's time. It wasn't true in Shakespeare's time. He wrote comedies, people had good time. 19th century novels are bleak. One of them is even called a bleak house. A number of Dickens novels, even when they end well, like A Christmas Carol, put you through hell to get there. If you bought a copy of A Christmas Carol and the last 8 pages were torn out, you'd think that Scrooge was a mess. If you go to see It's a Wonderful Life, which is a reworking of A Christmas Carol, and you're there when Jimmy Stewart is weeping and thinking about killing himself and completely demoralized, and you lose the last reel of that movie and you don't see that he's saved by donations and Clarence gets his wings, you want to blow your brains out. When he goes back and talks to his wife and his mother and they don't know him, and the bar that he used to go to is now a sleazy place, and you want to say this is one of the most depressing movies I've ever seen. It is an hour and 30 minutes of depression and it's 8 minutes of salvation, because that's the mode of so much movies and literature, including A Christmas Carol. It's bad, it's bad, it's bad. Oh, it's all good. I'm not being glib. This is what happened. We'll talk when we get to Erewhon about why tragedy takes the first place. But to go back to Liz's question, it's impossible for me to figure out why bad people can write great literature, make great art, make great painting. You can talk about directors, you can talk about musicians. Can't explain it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point to stop on, and I just wanted to thank you, of course, for sharing this with us and putting this together. I also wanted to thank the family of Amy Quigley, which I should have mentioned at the beginning, that this lecture and all these literature series are all made possible from the generosity of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. So, folks, unlike my jumbled dates comment from the beginning, next week will be also on Thursday at 7 o'clock, and we hope to see you all there. And we'll see you
Can I
tomorrow.
say that if you want my email address and you write to Michael, if you want to make inquiries about my website, I'm happy to answer them that way. I'd rather do it by individual request so I don't seem to be marketing on Michael's time. Thank you all. Thank you, Michael.
You bet. See ya. Good evening,
Yeah.
everybody, and see everybody next week. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.